Welcome back everyone to more Tony Stewart Sprint Car Racing. And in today's setup video, we'll be talking about the very first officially licensed racetrack, Knoxville Raceway, the very famous 1/2 mile track with very little banking and a fairly narrow racing groove. We'll be talking not only about a baseline setup that I'll be providing to you guys, but much more importantly, we'll be talking about some adjustments that you can make to the car to make it drive much more to your liking. We'll begin our setup discussion with the shock values. And as always, this is a matter of personal preference largely. Some people prefer the higher numbers up around 7, 8, or even 9, the maximum numbers for a car that has quicker weight transfers. You like a quicker feel to the car. Other people are, like me, are more on the bottom end. You prefer the minimum 3 to 5 range as it's a little bit softer feel to the car. However, on this track, there is a secondary interest in setting up your shock values, and that is the line between the apron of the track and what is considered to be the bottom groove. There's a banking transfer there that can de-wedge the car, particularly if you get your left front down there on it, and the stiffer the shock value you use, the harsher that transition will be. So using a little bit softer shock value can really help in softening that transition if that is something that you find yourself struggling with quite a bit. If you find yourself getting down off of that banking transition onto the flatter part of the track and it upsets the car, then try softening the shocks just a little bit. As always, I will not be going corner by corner on the car. Instead, I prefer to give you guys just sort of a middle road somewhere to start and let you guys work from there. Moving on to the weight settings, maximum left side weight, of course, because we're on an oval. Front weight is at the minimum 38.5. That is simply to allow the car to rotate a little bit better on corner entry. If you take a look at the raceable width of this track, it's not very wide, so that means your angles into and off the corners are a little bit sharper than you might see at some of the other tracks. Because of that, I wanted to move some weight a little bit further back in the car than I might normally use at a track this size. So 38.5 is the minimum and just allows the car to rotate a little bit more. However, if you find that the car is just too loose, just over rotating, then increase that number up around 39.0 or even higher. The cross weight is at 55.0, which is the maximum, which is a favorite for me. This is basically something I build the setup around simply because of how the car wants to be driven in this game. The car really doesn't want to be all that sideways, which sounds odd in a dirt racing game, but it really doesn't. It has a lot of similarities to the NASCAR Heat Series in that respect. So 55.0 really helps me to control the speed of the rotation of the car and allows me to be more precise. However, if you find that based on your driving style that you need the car to rotate quicker and more, then drop that number down to around 53, 52, or even lower, and that will definitely help the car to rotate much more overall and definitely a whole lot quicker. The front and rear heights, not really a lot to talk about here. You don't want the car to bottom out, and I really haven't had any issues bottoming out, even on the transition from the lower groove to the apron. However, there is obviously plenty of room for adjustment if you so choose. Moving on now to the torsion bars. This is somewhere that there is a lot of adjustability in the car to make the car looser or tighter depending on what you do in this area. I like to use the softest bars in general simply because it gives me a little softer feel to the car. However, if you want a stiffer feel out of the car, then increase these numbers all across the board. The most important thing to look at here is the relationship between the front bars and the rear bars, and also the relationship between the left and the right side. The relationship front to rear, for example, here we're using the minimum 0.95, and then 2 clicks higher than that at a 1.0 even. The difference between that and what you see in the rear of the car, the left sides are both equal, but the right rear is 1 click lower than the right front. I do that because I want to tighten the car up a little bit. It helps to snug the car up, give me a little bit more grip out of that right rear tire so that I don't get so loose and scrub off a lot of speed. However, if you feel like, particularly from the corner, center of the corner on exit, that you're just too tight, then come in and increase this number 1 to 2 clicks, and that will certainly help to free the car up. Same thing on the entry of the corner. If you feel like the car just doesn't turn to your liking, then one of your options, in addition to some things we talked about with the weight settings and some things we'll talk about under miscellaneous, then an option to loosen up the car on corner entry is to come in and drop this right front torsion bar diameter. Drop that by 1 to 2 clicks, and that will certainly help to loosen the car on corner entry. On the other side of things, if you're just too loose on corner entry and you need to tighten the car up, then try increasing this 1 or 2 notches and see if that doesn't help you out. Also, looking front to rear, you can do some things with a loose race car to tighten it up by simply coming in here and increasing both front torsion bars overall, and that will certainly tighten the car up and give you a little bit more traction from the center of the corner off if you are loose or loose overall for that matter. So again, a lot of adjustability there. Then looking at the preload, I like to load up the front of the car as opposed to the rear for the very reasons we were just talking about with the torsion bars. I prefer the car to be a little tighter so that it doesn't get as sideways, so that I don't scrub off as much speed. It allows me to be smoother and more precise with the car. However, if you find that the car is just too tight, one of your options is to reduce the right front preload. You can, right now I'm using the maximum of 3.0 on both the left front and the right front, but if you drop this right front preload closer to 0 on the right front, that's definitely going to loosen the car up. Now, looking at the left front of the car, the maximum of 3.0 tightens your exit of the corner there. So if the closer you get back down towards 0, the looser the car is going to want to be on the exit of the corner. So a ton of adjustability just looking at the torsion bars. And of course, the same thing can be said for the rear of the car. If you find that you're too loose on exit, then increase the left rear torsion bar, and that will tighten the car up from the center of the corner off. Same thing with the preload. Increasing this number will tighten the car on the exit of the corner. And then we've already talked a little bit about the right rear, and increasing this number will loosen the car overall as well as on corner exit. Same thing with the preload. The higher you make this number, the looser the car will be overall, and in particular on corner exit. Now moving on to the tire pressures. Didn't do a lot here, but there's certainly a lot of adjustability. In general, if you want a little bit better feel, a little bit more grip out of the car, then drop the overall tire pressures. If you want a little bit more top end speed, which is helpful at some of the tracks where you're easily wide open and it's all about maximizing your straightaway speed and minimizing the speed lost in the corners, then you want to increase the air pressures. However, these numbers for a baseline setup work really well for me. I don't touch, in general, the front tires unless I am really struggling with loose or tight and I need to adjust there. Where I'm most often going to adjust is a little bit in the right rear. So in the right rear, the default, I believe, is 9.0 PSI. Dropping that number to 6 or even lower will tighten the car up overall, and particularly on corner exit. Again, for me, it's all about controlling the car and being able to be very precise about where I put it on the track. So a lower air pressure works really well for me. But if you find that the car is just too tight overall, one of your options, in addition to the many other options we've talked about, is to increase this right rear pressure by a few pounds and see if that works for you. See if that gives you the results that you need. Moving on finally to the miscellaneous settings, the wheel spacing. Both of these numbers are maxed out. However, the left rear wheel spacing, the higher the number you use here, the tighter the car will be overall. So dropping this number to 14.0 or even lower will loosen the car. Then moving our attention to the right rear, the higher the number here, the looser the car will be overall. So the exact opposite of what we saw in the left rear. So dropping this right rear spacing will work to tighten up the car. So again, a lot of adjustability just in these two values as well. Brake bias isn't something I use a whole lot at this track, but when I use the brake bias outside of being in and around a lot of other cars, a lot of traffic concerns, and wanting to help control the car that way, just on a regular lap, a clean lap, if I'm going to use the brake bias, it will be to adjust the nose of the car and where it's pointing. So I want to make sure I'm always accelerating in the proper direction. So that's what I use the brake bias for. A slight tap here or there can help to point the nose where I want it. So the higher the number you use for the brake bias, the tighter the car will be. So if you find that you're getting too loose on the track, then try dragging the brake a little bit with a higher brake bias number, and that will help to tighten and secure the car a little bit more. On the flip side, a lower brake bias number will help to loosen the car if you want to tap the brake or drag the brake a little bit. So again, a lot of adjustability there in just the brake bias, and definitely is a great driving tool to use in the car. Now, front wing, I tried using minimum wing numbers on the front and rear, and it worked just fine. However, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to use very close to the maximum front and rear wing. So the front wing is only one step off of the maximum, which would be 30 degrees. And the reason I reduced that by one number is to tighten the car up just a little bit. Again, trying to be very precise with where I put the car on the track. But using the maximum front and rear wing certainly works just fine. In fact, I've run some extremely fast laps for me using that very setup. But the lower the number you use for the front wing, the tighter the car will be. And then moving over to the rear wing, the higher the number, the tighter the car. So dropping this number on the rear wing will help to loosen up the car if you find that the car is too tight. Now, the rear wing position, by default, it's at 0. The more we move this number toward the negative, the tighter the car will become. And that can be a good way to tighten up the car. However, I generally tend to shy away from it in most circumstances, simply because it tends to make the exit of the corner just too tight for me, and I end up scrubbing off more speed than I want to. So I generally like to leave this at 0 whenever possible. Moving on to the wheel lock, this is definitely a matter of personal preference. The default is up around 18. That is just too quick of a feel for me. I don't like that quick of a steering reaction, so I drop it down to around 10, sometimes even around 8 or 7 or lower, just to slow down the feel of the steering, just depending on the track and what I need from the car. But I prefer a lower number here, and the lower the number on the wheel lock, the slower the steering input. And again, that can really help you be more precise. But of course, some people prefer a much larger wheel lock, up around 18, 20, or even higher, and get much quicker steering. So the steering offset is tied very closely to the stagger, and because I'm using maximum stagger of the 20.0, that means my steering offset is generally going to be somewhere between 1.5 and about 1.75. That's about as high as I ever want to go with a stagger maxed out of 20.0. Again, everybody will be a little different in the feel you're looking for, but somewhere between 1.5 and 1.75 works well for me. Now, moving on to the stagger, 20.0 is where I am. However, you can certainly use less than this. The lower the stagger number you use, as we get down to 19, 18, and so on, the tighter the car will be. The car will not want to rotate very much. And of course, that can lead to the car getting very tight very quickly. So the best way to work with this number is, I find, start with the maximum 20.0. And if the car is just way too loose and you've tried some of the other adjustments we've talked about and it's just not working, then come over and start adjusting this by 2 or 3 at a time, just to get a feel for how this adjustment affects the car. And then from there, you can fine tune. Then finally, the rear end ratio, a lot of options you can use here. I've used up to a 5.0 and was hitting the rev limiter pretty hard at 5.0. So I've dropped it down at least a couple of clicks to give you guys somewhere to start. But as always, feel free to try out a few steps lower than this, a few steps higher than this. You can go all over the place and adjust the car. The higher the number you use for rear end ratio, the more RPMs you will turn, and generally the looser the car will be under throttle. The lower the number you use for rear end ratio, that's going to drop the RPM some and generally will tighten the car up and give it a more secure feel, since the engine is not turning quite as many RPMs. So that's going to do it for today. Hopefully this setup video will help you get started on your own journey for Knoxville Raceway. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned for more. Tony Stewart, Sprint Car Racing.